Paul, welcome to the show, mate. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dion. Lovely to be here.
Do you want to start by just giving us a little bit of background to your early entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in the country, and as most people from the country say, they tend to regard themselves as fairly practical. So you tend to have to do a lot of things growing up in a farming environment. And so there's almost nothing that you're allowed to say no to. You try your hand at everything. And the cycle on a farm means that you're doing a lot of different things all the time. From that, I went and studied commerce at UWA, joined Anderson Consulting, and the very nature of consulting meant you were walking in and seeing dozens of different businesses every year, usually because they were in some form of trouble and you were trying to help, and sometimes because they had great strategic ideas and you were looking to test those. The biggest challenge around that was if you would said to a client, well, if you follow this set of recommendations, you'll make $100 million. And they'll go, well, yeah, but you don't understand how things work around here. And it's like, come on, you're walking past $100 million. Or even worse, they would say, that's a great idea. And they'd go and do it. They'd make $100 million and you went back to your small salary and sat on the sidelines. And you never quite had your hands on the levers. And then we ended up doing a piece of strategy work for a telco entity that became funded by Curiousity. And the opportunity came to leave Anderson Consulting and be the COO of a startup telco. And it was exciting because it was a proper test of whether or not all these things that you preached as a consultant could actually be put into practice. And there's all these lessons that you talk about around the importance of cash flow. Well, living the importance of cash flow versus consulting the importance of cash flow, two entirely different experiences. But the idea that you could do a startup and think about an industry differently, and I think the word disruption is overused, but I think thinking about where value is created in a value chain and where consumers' expectations move to, I think that's great strategy. And the idea that you can find niches that keep, evolving industries and seeing startups and scale-ups move into that space, that was an exciting space. And that telco survived all of the challenges that OneTel threw at it. And so as a result of that, that was probably where I really got my taste for, okay, actually, is this fun? Can you actually create a meaningful difference in an industry or a business? And that was probably the start of it still drives most of my thinking today.
And what was the next step from there as you progressed with that business?
Yeah, so we ended up selling that business. I was based out of Cape Town in South Africa. It was an African-based telco, and we sold it as part of a corporate reorganization more broadly under the Kerry's Group. I came back and joined a Swiss multinational company called SGS. So a very large testing, inspection, and certification company headquartered out of Geneva, and worked there for about 15 years. Quite a remarkable business that's often very unheard of, but it was led by a guy called Sergio Marchionne. And Sergio Marchionne would be comfortably one of the most impressive businessmen I've ever worked with. And I've been very fortunate to have a lot of great leaders and mentors. But Sergio is just a remarkable intellect and a remarkable ability to be, on one hand on the shop floor and on the other in the White House, and equally comfortable and present in either circumstance. And has got a track record of fabulous turnarounds of organizations that started with, before SGS, I think it was Alius Swiss and Lonza, and then SGS quite famously. And then after that, probably more publicly, the turnaround of Fiat and then Chrysler and all of the things that followed from that. And so that was an extraordinarily rewarding industry to work in, because you felt very positive about the impact you were having on trade and commerce and industry. You got to explore the world. And then finally, we returned home. I could have happily stayed traveling the world. I'd been away for about 20 years, could have happily stayed traveling the world for a long time. Then family reasons brought us back to Perth. And then I stumbled into Imdex, where I am today. And just completely fortuitous that we found a global business headquartered out of Balcatta in the north of Perth that invested money in R&D and was really trying to change the whole industry. It was really good fun.
You've got a really diverse background by way of where you've come from, where you've traveled, and in terms of the business experience you've had. What are the single most impactful aspects of that background in terms of your views of going forward? Yeah.
Gosh, a number of those things, and you tend to accumulate them as you go. But easily the understanding that transition from being a management consultant to actually running a startup, and the reward that you get, the thrill from having your hands on the levers and the accountability that comes with that. One thing believing it, the other thing doing it, and the battle scars you pick up along the way. Easily, and incredibly formative part of your life. And then, as I said, 20 years overseas, mostly on secondment to the World Bank or overseas with SGS, working predominantly in third world environments, just the diversity of cultures, but the commonality of intellects, which is most people probably haven't thought about it, but there's a lot of bright people in so many parts of the world, and they all share usually a lot of common traits around being curious and wanting to do good things. But to see how that's applied in different cultures, from Central Africa to India to Mongolia, the breakup of the Soviet Union, versus being in the heart of, I was in St. Louis, Missouri for over a year. And so the sheer diversity of those experiences is enormous, but the underlying threads that tie them all together, I think, is probably one of the most surprising things out of that journey.
Was there any one of those places, just out of curiosity, that really surprised you as you were sort of seeing different parts of the world, and you've got a lot of different comparison points? Was there any one place that you went, oh wow, I didn't see that coming?
Yeah, I'd say the complexity of working in India above all else. So by the time I got to India, I'd worked in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, Australia, and the US, and so I was a grandmaster of checkers, for want of a better term. But in India, they play chess, and so they had a horse that went two up and one across, and I didn't have a horse that went two up and one across, and so you constantly get surprised. Of course, it wasn't a surprise within India because I've always had a horse that went two up and one across. So I think the sheer depth of complexity of that operating environment, socially and professionally, absolutely was a positive surprise, I might add. It was delightful. It's not for everyone. Not every expat comes away feeling the same way about India, but my wife and my family, we lived there for 8 years. And so we obviously delighted, and it was great fun. But easily that'd be the most impactful place I lived, and where looting just never stopped.
When you're building businesses in different parts of the world, what are the commonalities between building culture and fostering high-performing teams in different places? What are the common links that you see?
It's always people. I mean, I think you do people first and strategy second would be, the most important thing. And then the people that will help you along that journey the most are usually the ones that are the most curious. And so I think curiosity is one of the most undervalued characteristics in teams. It happens to be one of the key values at Imdex that was actually brought out by a survey of our entire workforce. And so even then, I wouldn't have said curiosity 5 years ago. It was only because as our own teams elevated that to be one of the most important values of our business, that I realized that that's one of the things that underpinned every team I've been a part of. And so I think curiosity, absolutely, people first, to set up strategy second, and within those people, it's curiosity that's key.
Why do you think it's curiosity?
The idea that you can do something differently or change. Are you going to test things? Are you going to take a risk? Are you going to challenge the status quo? I think most great ideas never get off the ground if you don't have fundamentally a curious mind and fundamentally a desire to challenge or change whatever the status quo may be in an industry or a social system, whatever that looks like. And so I think it is absolutely a foundational requirement for any successful business initiative, whether embedded in a large organization or whether it's a startup or scale up.
And that's something that you've seen because that's the first time I've heard that answer. And it makes sense, right? Intelligent people are curious, and that comes with it. People who are curious, it implies an enthusiasm for learning and all sorts of things that go with that, right? So that it's multi-layered. But it's the first time I've probably heard someone say that curiosity is number one amongst the teams that they work with. Is that something you see in other teams, ones that you haven't been a part of? Is that a norm, or is it something that you think is uniquely a part of high-performing teams?
So often the answer to that question is there's this relentless discipline, and passion always floats to the top. And I think all those things are true, but they all come from an underlying place or purpose that had to pre-exist before passion, I think, finds its feet. And discipline starts to drive how you then execute on what you've decided you want to test or discover. And so, I think if you asked most other leaders how they ended up getting to that point and why passion is so important, it would go back to things like curious and a drive for change or a drive to do things differently. I think you find that's a common thread.
In terms of things that you might do differently if you had your time over, And a lot of times it's easy to say, no, everything's all part of that journey. I wouldn't change anything good or bad. But is there anything that you would do differently over that time?
Look, I remember learning about mindfulness not all that long ago. And one of my key takeaways from understanding mindfulness was don't look back too far and don't look forward too far. Live exactly where you are right now, which means you don't regret or live in the past, but you might learn from it, but you don't live there. You don't long for the future at the expense of saying, well, what are we going to do now? And so, I think all the things, even the bad experiences of the past, ultimately are extraordinarily formative. And even just acknowledging that is a key part about putting those experiences to good use. If I had to reframe your question slightly in terms of, well, how could you put it to better use? I think speed would be, you always look back and think, well, that could have happened faster. We could have made those decisions sooner. I think in general, that's it.
Moving faster in terms of decision making or in terms of action?
Action, definitely action. Yeah.
In terms of your background, go back to the farming side of things, where you originally come from. What are the traits that you bring from that are still applied today in terms of the philosophy and the thinking and that type of perspective?
Yeah. Well, look, farm is an enormously practical discipline. And it's quite interesting, when I first moved to the city, there was always a perception that farmers might be slow technology adopters. And, my experience is exactly the opposite is true.
Yeah.
They're often highly accountable. It's their own business. They're highly dependent on external events. So therefore, they externalize what they can't control, and they absolutely are curious about things they can control. Number one. Number two is you tend to find that a farming life cycle over the course of just a single year involves so many varied disciplines. There is no Groundhog Day in the farming environment. So you're required to find and run into things every day that you may not be familiar with, and you have to stop, assess, work out how you're going to solve the problem. So there's an enormous amount of mental exploration and an enormous amount of practical innovation that I think comes from a farming background. And it tends to carry over into whatever pursuit you then take outside of farming.
Does that translate into things like, and I'm making assumptions here, but does that translate into things like just you're exposed throughout your childhood effectively to just getting on with things, being a problem solver? There's no time for messing around. You get in there, work it out, fix it, move on, and carry on the next thing. There's a level of pragmatism, resilience, and all those things that a lot of people today don't, from a city perspective, they don't have instilled in them in the same way. And I think there's a massive advantage to people who grew up in that situation.
Yeah, I think there's a grit, right? So you don't get to externalize blame or events. You actually have to go, well, what am I going to do? You have to assess, you have to make a decision, and you have to act and do something. There's another surprising characteristic that I probably didn't expect to find when I went to India. And India is widely regarded as having an entrepreneurial culture, if you like. But when you get deeper under the layers of it, there is a word in Hindi called jugaad. And jugaad basically translates as find a way. And so find a way to get things done, find a way to solve the problem, find a way to get through whatever it is you're going through. And I think it's a wonderful word. And it probably epitomizes that broad practicality that says, well, it doesn't matter what you think your discipline is, what you were trained in, or what you think other people's responsibilities are. Here you are, here's the challenge, what are you going to do? And I think you find anything that you attribute to entrepreneurial success or practical business leadership, which all farmers are because it's mostly owner-operated farms, or the entrepreneurial mindset of a place like India, and then bring that over into any startups and scale-ups that have been successful in our more contemporary world. And I think that's a common characteristic.
How many people are employees there at Imdex today?
818.
So you've got 818 people. When you first started in the consulting area, you're sort of doing your own thing. Then you move into building businesses. How do you learn those management skills, how to manage people? What was the biggest learning curve for you?
Yeah, great. So it's a lot about common outcomes where you go through an organization like Anderson Consulting, and you do go through some pretty good, rigorous technical and soft skill or leadership development. Okay. And so you pick up some of those skills there. That gets battle hardened when you run a startup telco. There's no getting away from it. Those issues land on your desk, and you make those decisions as you go. And then you have, I think, finding great people to mentor or to watch for inspiration And I mentioned Sergio Marchionne earlier. I mean, he is, again, quite a remarkable intellect and a remarkable leader. And if you find those people and you understand why people follow them, why they've been successful, you learn a lot about leadership along that journey. But I think you've got to start out by assuming you do not know and will not know it all. And the circumstances will always be shifting under your feet. And so again, you have to be open-minded to that, aware of, curious to, alert to those possibilities or that challenge.
In terms of leading teams, what was your biggest strength? And all the flip side of that is also, what was your biggest weakness early on and even today, I guess?
Personally, I just fundamentally like people, and I like how different people are. And I think that's probably by accident been really a fortuitous part of the teams that I've been a part of or helped put together, in that you tend to find ways to connect to each other before you've decided, well, what strategy or journey are we embarking upon? And that creates a bit of a commitment to each other and a shared purpose and a shared understanding of how each of us is going to collectively deliver that goal, as opposed to individually we might think we're going to achieve that goal. And so that like of people is key to then creating collective intelligence in a team that is, I think, very powerful for teams that have it. Probably the blind spot so that it sometimes creates, and for me, and we talk about this in our own leadership group, but I'm very comfortable in areas of chaos or uncertainty.
Okay.
I'm extremely calm in when the rest of the world is falling apart. And so I think kind of clearly. I don't get too flustered by it, but what I will miss is that some of my team may not be feeling the same way. And so the assumption that everyone else is joined together is one thing, but feeling the same experience when you're going through periods of stress or uncertainty or chaos is quite another.
How do you learn to get better at that as you go along, cover up on blind spots?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of professional development for individuals. I think the thing that addresses some of those concerns is, what does professional development for a team look like? And so we have a coach that works on us as a group, and so we work out, well, who are going to be the truth tellers in our group? What is each person's version of a safe word, for want of a better expression, that really signals that I think that person's actually in trouble or not keeping pace or has something on their mind that they're not sharing. And so we spend a lot of time working out, well, how are we going to recognize those situations where we run into them, and who in our group is going to be the truth teller? We're going to step in and check out if everyone's on the same page or not. And it's that group investment, I think that's key.
You run a very large global business from WA. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Well, if you ask me now versus when we were shut down with COVID from the rest of the world, I could give you very different answers. Although you do learn to run remote teams very effectively, and quite frankly, I think COVID accentuated that for everyone. If there was an unintended consequence or betterment for leadership groups around the world, it would be working out how to run remote teams. I think there's certainly disadvantages in time zones compared to some of our major markets. There's advantages in actually making sure that local knowledge, local behaviors, local drivers, local politics are respected and understood, and you need to be able to listen to those groups around the world. I think delegating down to those local decision makers and knowing what you're delegating, so you centralize process, but you decentralize decision making, are really key important traits for running a global business. And then it doesn't matter where you're based.
In terms of some of the business people, and you've mentioned Sergio, who were some of the business people that you look at, they might inspire you, or you like the way they go about business? Who comes to mind?
Yeah, look, Sergio is easily, he had this management by walking around philosophy, where he really felt that you could only take the pulse of a group by being present on the floor, and it wouldn't come through an email or a call. It wouldn't come through a meeting room. You had to be on the shop floor and not just hear what was said, but hear how it was said. See how the body language shifted in a room, not just the speaker, but of the audience. And he had a real knack for finding that in the room and then being able to communicate his message back to that room in the same way. That was remarkable. Probably the other surprising one, perhaps surprising, was, I think, Kerry Stokes. And we were involved in a business where we ended up in an arbitration proceeding. And rightly or wrongly, Kerry would have been regarded in the late 90s and early 2000s as one of the more litigious businessmen in the Australian corporate world. And when we ended up in this position, the advice came through very clearly. He goes, look, to be really absolutely clear with you, this is only money and you have to sleep well at night. So we know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. We will just play a straight bat on this all the way through. And it was just a really remarkably calming reminder that at the end of the day, one of the most important things is you have to sleep well at night. And so
Yeah.
if you conduct yourself responsibly, then that story should always come through at the end of the day. And in this particular case, that's exactly what happened. But it was amazingly effective in being a calming narrative, I guess, that you could recenter to when you found yourself under a fair bit of attack.
And you say surprisingly, but what was why do you say surprisingly in that regard?
Well, I think only because of the front page sort of tabloid
Yeah. Okay.
reputation
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
Kerry was quite a litigious guy,
Yeah.
and certainly the experience I had was anything but. So defend his people, defend his business, absolutely, but absolutely with a really strong moral compass.
And in terms of business, how it's changed over the years, what are the biggest changes you've noticed in the last 20, 30 years? How business is done?
Yeah, look, definitely speed. I think the focus on teams. I think you went through cycles where information went from being decentralized to being centralized, and now we're going back the other way a little bit. I think the enabling speed of technology and making our businesses more borderless than ever we're still really going through, I think, some of those changes. But in my time at SGS, one of the industries we served was the textiles industry. And I remember fashion cycles used to be seasonal. And so there would be 4 seasons in a year. And next thing you know, we're doing 52 seasons in a year because the supply chains got so tight, they were looking at declining sales of certain styles on the
Right.
cash register in real time, being analyzed centrally, and in real time changing what manufacturing
Wow.
orders were going out. And so you found these, all right, stop producing that, move to the next thing, do it now, put those other items on sale. And so that supply chain tightened up really, really quickly. And watching industries like that evolve was remarkable. What's probably more interesting is from a business like SGS, where you had a vantage point into all these different industries, is how little cross-pollination of ideas happened across industries. At one point, I was leading an innovation team inside of SGS, and we had to decide, well, what is innovation? It's a pretty broad church. How are we going to put some boundaries around that? And we concluded that for us, innovation meant do nothing new. And so it was simply find a good idea in one part of the world or in one industry and work out if it has application in any other parts of the world or industry that we already operate in.
Yeah.
And so, we were just taking that simple premise about how do you cross-pollinate great ideas across industries that otherwise, for some reason, don't share, presents enormous opportunities.
And simply because that's a very efficient way to innovate, because you
Massively.
don't need to come up with anything new as such, just applying it across wherever it would best apply.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was one of the successes to Sergio Marchionne. It was a guy called Chris Kirk taught me that. And it was a really famous example with a guy called Anthony Hall, who I used to work with. We were running a geochemistry laboratory business, and the biggest cost in geochemistry was the fire assay that you had to do to take the sample, crush it, and then fire it into a pellet that you then took into the laboratory for analysis. And at that time, kilns held about 16 samples. You'd use a stopwatch and you were trying to line them up so you could move them quickly. And we would get the sample cost from sort of 94 cents down to 92 cents. And if we had a really good day, from 92 cents down to 90 cents. And Chris Kirk said to Tony, well, look, this is ridiculous. We're not going to get market leadership at 90 cents. What does 60 cents look like? Just stop, step back, rethink this whole thing. And everyone was a bit depressed and they all went home. And on Saturday morning, Tony went to buy his cup of coffee and his loaf of bread. He went to his local bakery and they were installing new bread ovens and they had the wall down. And he could see these big kilns being wheeled in for bread. And he said, oh my God, that's actually just a really bigger version of a sample prep kiln. And he said to the guys, well, what are you doing with your old bread ovens? And they said, would you believe we have to pay somebody $7,000 to cart these away? And he goes, I'll do it for 5. I'll be here in an hour. He got a truck. He rang the team and he said, all right, it was a Saturday. He goes, all right, come round to the office. I'll bring the welding gear. I'll put on a barbecue at the end of the day, but here's what we're going to do. Within 72 hours, 90 cents had become 28 cents.
Really?
And so it made this massive step change in sample prep and the geochemistry market share. And I'll get these numbers slightly wrong, but for scale, we'll be right. They went from sort of 5% market share to 45% market share in less than 12 months. And then in another 12 months, the whole industry was doing it the same way. And
Wow.
so all it did was take something out of food and move it into minerals. And one of the biggest lessons I think we took out of that was the industries that are perishable or have to service broad populations tend to be some of the most innovative in terms of safety, speed, and cost.
Yeah. Okay.
And so how do you find those innovations and take them into B2B applications that are otherwise stuck on process or stuck on some other legacy idea about what efficiency looks like?
Yeah, I guess that's twofold, right? There's one of going to look for those ideas that can apply. Then there's taking those ideas and seeing where they apply, but then it's going out and finding where those ideas are that you can overlay on what you're doing. So it goes both ways, right? In terms of books that you've read over the years, are there any that come to mind that are particularly favorites?
Yeah, so we're a bit of a voracious reader, so we would read, I do mostly audio books and I do it when I run in the morning or on the car or in the car or on the plane. Anything by Malcolm Gladwell or Michael Lewis, who are two of my favorite authors by far. They can take really complex, dry subjects and turn them into, well, not quite a white knuckle roller coaster ride, but a really good read.
Yeah. They tell stories really well.
Yeah, they really do. And I took things like Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point when it came out. And even when you were just trying to create a cultural change around safety in an organization in India, ultimately those 3 points of, well, who are the connectors? Who are the people that know everything? And who are the people that can sell anything? Where are those people in our workforce? And how do I speak to them about the safety journey we want to go on? Because if I find them, the whole group will shift and change. And so Gladwell, Lewis, very clearly. But one of my favorite books would be a book called Playing to Win by Roger Martin, which is a really simple strategy framework. It's an outstanding book that you can embed those strategic thinking deeply into an organization. Anything to do with commodities, and by that I mean there's books like Salt or Cod by Mark Kalansky, which basically tell a biography of a commodity, but how it's impacted the world we live in today. The Prize by Daniel Yergin, very similar. Material World by Ed Conway, very similar. Just remarkable stories that you don't realize how much of those things shape the current world that we live in.
Well, that's a very diverse sort of array of books and topics. Do you look at those things in terms of curious about the origins? Are you a history buff as well? Or is it just curious about how things have come to be?
Massive history buff, but probably the answer is more to the latter. Right? How did things come to be? Yeah, that's absolutely why those stories around the history of a commodity, the biography of commodity are so fascinating, to me at least. So I'm sure it's not.
No, I totally agree. I not everyone probably thinks that, but yeah, I totally agree. It is fascinating. Some of these things that you don't realize just how important some things were, whether it's a commodity or other things, the history of and their role in the world over many, many years is quite incredible.
In Material World by Ed Conway, the first chapter talks about silica or sand becoming glass and what you could do to refine a lens and what that meant during World War I and World War II, and how part of the advantage was closing out supply chains in those two, in the area of lenses between Germany and Great Britain. And so all of these stories as they evolve were just fascinating.
Yeah, see, that is fascinating because you're talking about something that seems kind of insignificant. I mean, you could easily dismiss it, right? And just about everything's like that when you go through and drill into a particular commodity or topic or whatever it might be, and you find those things that are incredibly important in history, in terms of historical events as well, like you were talking about in some of those other aspects. And yeah, okay, that's very cool. What about in terms of innovation? You guys are in the technology space. What do you see evolving in technology? You talk about how things move quicker these days. What about AI and things like that? What do you see in that space as it applies to your business?
Yeah. Oh, look, obviously a lot. I think one of the misunderstood things about AI is that it's been around for a while. We're just probably reaching peak hype, if you like, and we're slowly moving towards some really practical applications. One of the second misunderstood thing about AI or large language models even is that they are a literature form or a research form of essentially a calculator. So instead of doing handwritten long division, you'll get out your calculator. Do you understand the fundamentals? Yes. Do you want to stick to the discipline of handwritten long division? No, we're past that. And so AI and large language models and computer vision driving machine learning, all of those are just extensions, I think, of that simple mathematical application to a much broader data field. The key for it, though, is do you have the data? Not only that, but do you have the quality of data? Because you can search bad quality data and still get a bad quality summary. That's where the emphasis on quality is going to come to the fore, followed by the emphasis on where else can we originate more data sets from which we can now start applying some of these technologies that give us scale. And what you'll find, I think, is that by just shortening of decision making and things that do take time, take, for example, the length of time it takes to bring a copper mine into production. Well, what parts of that mine development value chain could you compress and accelerate if you had greater data being made available earlier on? Would you change mining methods, mine design, speed to development, or not? Or would you kill things that you only find out in 10 years were never going to be viable, but now you know they're not going to be viable, so you kill it earlier? Just as vital an application.
Yeah, so you don't necessarily need to speed things up, but if you've got multiple projects that you're doing, eliminating the ones that aren't going to eventuate increases the probability of the ones that are, because you're not having the losses to offset.
Well, there's a well-cliched saying, and most cliches exist because they're true, but strategy is about choices. And the choices you choose not to make are as vital, if not more valuable, than the choices you do make around about what you will do.
Where's Imdex going in the next few years? What's the vision ahead?
Well, I think the outlook for our industry is pretty exciting, to be honest. If I stay on the theme of cliches, there's a cliched saying that everything we consume is either farmed or mined, which in my mind would make farming and mining two of the most noble professions on the planet. However, there are a number of bad actors in that space, which often cast a front page headline shadow that means most of the communities that depend on farming and mining, and that's all of us, don't understand what vital role these two industries, and more recently mining, play in whatever we think our societal aspirational needs are. And I think that's slowly changing. You're starting to see mining companies get better about articulating their own role in society. You're starting to see these policy-driven and consumer-led or elector-led, perhaps, agendas towards our responsibility towards emissions and the planet more broadly follow the trail back to, well, what is the role of mining in helping us address some of those concerns? And with that, you'll find greater eyes, greater intellect, greater dollars being pointed into our industry, all with the view of trying to accelerate how we unlock some of the Earth's critical resources so that we can solve some of these slightly more existential social challenges that we all know we need to address.
Final one, Paul, what advice would you give to people going into business?
Oh, find great people, whether that's mentors, whether that's peers, or whether that's as you're building your first teams. Just find great people. Work out what you want to do after that. You might have an idea of what you want to do, but the only way to do it is if you use the collective intelligence of great people around you. And again, they could be mentors that you follow and look up to and seek advice from. Could be managers, could be peers that you work with. It could be teams underneath you that you work to build. And in doing so, I think ensuring that you have a demand for learning all the time. And that's quite courageous. You've got to be able to bin things that you're passionate about, you've invested a lot of time in, when you realize that you're seeing enough signals and recognizing the signals for what they are, that something might not be going in a certain direction. And I think that comes if you surround yourself with the right teams. And it just always comes back to surround yourself with great people.
Yeah. Paul, thank you very much for your time, mate. It's been great to have you on the show.
Dion, a pleasure. Have a great day.